and welcome back to Talking the Gothic with me, Essie Fox. This episode is coming a little later than expected, but while I was preparing for it, I was reading several books by the author Paul Magrs, and I've been utterly engrossed. For those of you who don't yet know him, and I'm going to put that right today, Paul is a talented author, a screenwriter, an artist, and an academic. His published work includes books written for children, a series of thrillers also linked to the Doctor Who franchise. But what I'm going to focus on today is my most recent obsession, and that's his series of novels based in the coastal town of Whitby and featuring the aging female leads of Brenda and Effie, with Brenda being the bride of Frankenstein's monster who is living in Whitby in disguise, and Effie her friend who runs a junk antique shop next door and who turns out to be related to a powerful family of witches. The Brenda and Effie Mysteries are Gothic through and through, but they're also very funny. An ingenious black humour that's guaranteed to make you laugh, and very loudly at times. I've had a few strange looks recently when I've been out walking the dog and listening on Audible. And yet the stories also have the power to chill to the bone. And this is the essence of this subgenre of the Gothic that I think many people tend to overlook because perhaps they assume that it simply wouldn't be the thing for them. Because after all, what is the Gothic, if not a serious and morbid exploration of the dark side? But aren't there times when even the most terrifying horror can actually excite us to laughter? It's not uncommon to be sitting in a cinema when someone reacts to a particularly gruesome scene by laughing out loud, and that's because fear and laughter are both heightened extremes of emotions. And these extremes, these reactions, can go together hand in hand, and sometimes they can be used to great effect. In the right hands at the right time, this Gothic genre can work as comedy, although at times the comedy, I admit, is unintentional, such as in Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, which I featured in the first episode of this podcast series, where there's a scene in which a man is crushed to death beneath the sudden apparition of a giant feathered helmet. It really is ridiculous, and I wonder if such scenes might have provided inspiration for the Monty Python team in some of their TV sketches, because it has that sort of totally extreme, ridiculous aspect to it. But going back to Walpole's time, there were also many Gothic satires that resulted from his novel, such as Nightmare Abbey by Thomas Love Peacock, or The New Monk by Sycamore, which is a send-up of the simmering potboiler called The Monk by Matthew Lewis. And another example is a book called More Ghosts, which I think is a great title. And that's a three-part Gothic horror with the author only tantalizingly listed on the front cover as the wife of an officer. So perhaps that's an early example, literally, of a ghostwriter. In the Victorian era, the lust for gory stories continued with the penny dreadfuls, a form of weekly pamphlets cheaply sold on the streets and with cliffhanger endings that left the readers desperate to buy more instalments. And one of the most popular and long-running of these was Varney the Vampire, otherwise known as The Feast of Blood, which was described on the covers as a romance of exciting interest. Well, this lurid vampiric melodrama introduced many tropes that we are familiar with now. And however, they are sort of a bit like Walpole's Castle of Otranto, because the humour of Varney was, I think, not deliberately intended, but even so, it's very amusing, with plots that run on and never seem to end, and dialogue that's so repetitive it goes round and round in circles, and with one female character who does very little more than faint. I have to say, I would love a writer today to reinvent Varney's exploits, either as a novel or as a dramatization for our screens, even taking visual clues from the original illustrations because they are so hilariously cliched. But when it comes to Varney, I think I'm going to come back and do a complete episode about that one day, but that's for a future date. For now, talking about other cliched and amusing Gothic themes. These can be found in films like Carry On Screaming or The Rocky Horror Show, Dracula, Dead and Loving It, Beetlejuice, The Corpse Bride, The Addams Family, and What We Do in the Shadows. And thinking again, actually, of What We Do in the Shadows, I really recommend the UK television version, which is so quirky and original. And there's a charismatic cast, including Matt Berry, Natasja Demetriou, Kaivan Novak, Harvey Guillen, and Mark Prush. And they play a diverse group of vampires who share a house in Staten Island while taking part in a fictional mockumentary. So if vampires and comedy are your thing, do watch this. I have to say, the skill of writing such a script is one that very few of us possess, but there is someone I know who does, and that's Paul Magrs. He's my guest today, and he has that talent in spades. And without further ado, I'd like to say hello to Paul and to offer him a big welcome to Talking the Gothic.
Hello.
It's really lovely for you to come along. I'm so excited to talk to you. You know, I'm a great fan of your work. And
Thank you.
I hope by the end of this, everybody else will be a great fan of your work as well. And they should be, and they will be. Um, but just to give you a quick background, I was reading on your website that you were at school with Paul Gattis and that you were in a drama group. And I thought that was so interesting because basically, what I was wondering is, what was the influence of your school days and drama groups and things like that on your work now? Because your work is very theatrical and cinematographic, and your dialogue is fantastic. So, tell us a little bit about those school days and the influence they might have had.
It's funny to think about, really. It was Woodham Comprehensive School, and we didn't really have drama because it was during the teachers' strikes of the early 1980s. So
Oh,
we felt very left out. The year group that joined in 1981 at Woodham, and it was quite a rough school of about 1,000 people in a new town in the northeast. Um, and we didn't have school trips or after school clubs. Mark Gatiss was in the year 2 years ahead of us, and he had all of that. And he came from a posh village outside of town, and he was my big crush when I was 10, because he was very out and flamboyantly gay at school, as I remember, and used to play the drums during assembly.
oh, he had
He'd
it
obviously
all.
been given he'd been given a drum kit for Christmas or something. And so while Mr. Smith is plonking away on the piano, there's this huge drum kit and this lad smashing away. That's my memory. But he'd been in things like the Dracula Spectacular and Godspell. They'd had these shows, and we thought when you got to the comp, you got to do all of this stuff. And of course, we didn't because nothing happened. The teachers were on strike, and the kids went on strike as a result. And there was pandemonium really in 1981. But there were some wonderful English teachers and drama teachers who created trips all the
Hmm.
way through our school. They whether they should have been doing it or not. I think the strikes were over quite quickly, but the will goes out of things, so there was no clubs. But we had teachers who took us on trips, and so drama club really was a couple of trips to Darlington Civic Theatre in the cars of two teachers. We had Mr. Boston and Mr. Watson, who was fabulous. But the drama group essentially was me and my friend Michael, and then Mark being taken off to Darlington Civic to see The Irresistible Rise of Arturo Ui,
Oh,
the Brecht play about a
yeah,
Chicago gangster whose
yeah.
life shadows Hitler's, which Mark is about to play at the RSC
Wow,
all these years on.
how
But I do
amazing.
remember this night very clearly of all of us going in the car and coming back and Mark coming out with really rude limericks. So he was always a figure there. But See, we had the same English teachers all the way through, and there's John Gallagher, who I'm still friends with, who was quite a young teacher then, looking back. I think he wasn't even 30. And he taught me and he taught Mark, but he also taught George Mann, who is a science fiction novelist.
Oh,
He writes steampunk
right.
novels, and he
Yes,
writes
and that is
comics.
this, yeah, and well, I mean, because you do so much more than what we're going to talk about today, and I can see that, perhaps there's that crossover there as well.
Well, he
Definitely.
told us. I think the thing about that particular teacher, about John, was that we were all obsessed with Doctor Who, and he told all of us at different times. You know, Mark, 2 years ahead of me, George, 10 years younger. Don't just read Doctor Who. Here's Sherlock Holmes. Here's H.G. Wells.
Yeah. Wow.
Here's whoever. Here's the Pan books of horror to try and broaden our remits, and you can see the
You
imprint of
can
that on all of our
absolutely
work. And
see
so
this is
it's
fantastic,
fascinating to be able
amazing.
to go back to a teacher and say,
Yeah.
your recommendations.
Wow. Have
Um,
you ever gone back to those teachers? Are they still alive? Have you
oh
ever?
yeah, I mean John's still a
Yeah. Yeah.
friend. We
Great.
go and
Great.
visit his friend, him and his wife Lynn,
Great.
in Durham.
How
And Lynn
wonderful.
Heritage, another teacher I had from that time, he taught me at sixth form. So I've stayed friends with them. I mean, the thing about when you do books, people stay in touch because you're visible.
Yeah.
And I remember the very first reading I ever gave was at the Middlesbrough Literature Festival in 1996. And I'd published a short story that had got quite a lot, quite a big review in The Guardian. And so they put this thing on and they had me on with a lovely playwright. And just before this event began in this pub in Middlesbrough, um, all the English teachers I'd ever had turned up. They'd hired a minibus from school to come to this literature festival in the evening. And they all shuffle in at the last minute. It was
That's
like,
so
this is our
amazing.
life.
That's very, oh, it does sound like this is your life. That sounds so touching. Well,
It
thank
was
you
really
for,
nice.
yeah, thank you for that. That's brilliant. And that's just so lovely. I think I hope all teachers who really go the extra mile, you know, some of them might hear this and realize how grateful we are for that.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, Coming on today, we're going to talk about your Brenda and Effie Mysteries today because it's a Gothic podcast, and I love Brenda and Effie, as you know, and I think they would make the most amazing Netflix series. They have darkly comic plots, hosts of brilliant characters. It's all portrayed so vividly. And the action is set in a world imbued with thrilling mysteries, classic horror, fantasy, magical realism. But before we delve a little bit more deeply into the characters and the themes of the books, can we talk a little bit about the setting being Whitby?
Mm,
The coastal town of Whitby, which is almost like a character in itself. It's quaint and sinister, and you do some really beautiful descriptions, of the narrow, winding streets swathed in dense, swirling sea mists, and the indigo of the twilight hours descending over the roofs of the houses. The Abbey, of course, the shops, some of which have hilarious puns. I mean, you're great at punning. I always chuckle when you have mentioned the chip shop, Cod Almighty.
mhm.
But can you, which plays a big important part, the mushy peas and the chips are very important. But can you tell our listeners today a little bit more about Whitby, as in how close is it to your heart? Did you know it before you wrote these novels? And its influence on your work. And what I'm going to say is, right at the end of this podcast, we're going to come around to Whitby again because I know what we're going to talk about something you're doing at the moment, um, which is linked to Doctor Who.
Mm.
Um, but for now, can you just tell us, your love of a Whitby?
Well, it's somewhere we went to because I grew up in Newton Aycliffe near Darlington. So the seaside to us was Whitby. And if you had family visit and family from abroad would come and visit, you would take them somewhere to show off. And actually, Staithes was the place as well. And um, when I thought back, I realized that I'd confused all these places in my mind um, from being a kid. Staithes and Robin Hood's Bay and Whitby were all mixed up in my mind, and they were frozen as Victorian towns, which they were to an extent. Actually, they were preserved really well until quite recently.
Mm.
Um, and that those kind of very steep streets and the way the houses are arranged and that particular Gothic atmosphere were all frozen in my head from these days out. We took it for granted, though. You know, we lived in a place where you would take a day out and this would be the James Herriot trip, or this would be the Beatrix Potter trip to the Lake District. It's a very literary landscape. That
Mm,
was my experience of going on day trips or holidays. So you always went book in hand, really.
right.
Um, and it wasn't until many years later that I went as an adult, by chance, and it was while I was lecturing at UEA, and I went back home, and just on a whim, Jeremy and I said, "Let's pop by Whitby, not been for years." And we raced in and got a hotel at the last minute. And it just happened to be the hotel where Lewis Carroll had stayed and his room where he'd stayed and more or less began Alice.
I didn't
So that
know
was kind of
that. I didn't know
magical.
that. Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
there's a wonderful book by Brian Talbot, a graphic novel
Right.
called Alice in Sunderland about Lewis Carroll's links with the Northeast. Because, of course, he begins his life, I think this is right, as uh, growing up just outside of Darlington
Right.
and returned to the region with
Oh,
various
brilliant.
points.
Oh, well, that's so interesting. Now, at the center of this town in your novel, we have the central character of Brenda, a woman in her late middle age who wants nothing more than to play the perfect B&B host. And she offers her guests every possible comfort. And she loves a good chat. But as she also tells the reader, nobody knows about my past. Well, they certainly don't at the beginning of the novel. Obviously, it unravels as things go on. But she also, Brenda, at the beginning, forgets quite a lot because she's prone to lapses of memory
Mm.
to some extent because she's lived for a very, very long time and she's beset by lurid dreams and there are things in her attic which really do go bump. And I won't say any more than that, but in your hands, they become hilarious, but they could also be extremely sinister. What I love about Brenda is how what might normally be perceived as a kind of mundane daily life is seamlessly blended with supernatural adventures. So, can you tell us a little bit more about this marvel of a character and a marvel of a woman who, I mean, I just wonder, have you based her on any people you know as well? Because the way she talks and her warmth and her kindness, um, she's so human, even though she is in your novel created by Frankenstein as the bride for his monster.
She is. I think I grew up listening to all the women in our family, coming from a very northeastern Tyneside family on both sides. Um, all the women talked. So it was my life as a kind of a very young gay kid listening. All the men sitting in one room watching the football silently,
Yeah,
rarely speaking. But in the kitchen, there was life and stories. And I would sit and listen and write it all down,
yeah,
and keep all this stuff.
brilliant.
It's gossip.
I
And that's
thought
where
that
it comes from. Yeah.
because I
And I
remember
think
with my family it was like that. It was like nobody in my family read or wrote, but stories were continually going on, and it wasn't just gossip. They would tell you about that, things that happened
the
in their
legends.
childhood and
Yeah.
legends, and yeah, and local stories
And
going
also
back.
people seeing themselves as the hero of their own stories, their family stories, and everyone else being heroes in it. They're family legends. And it's something I feel very strongly about that that kind of, well, it's an oral tradition
Exactly, and I think
being
what's really
part of the kind of
important
literary
is
record.
people who are aspiring to write, maybe who might be listening to this podcast, even if you want to write about dark things, the Gothic, whatever. Obviously, today we're talking about, comedy in the Gothic, but really, I think it's really important to dig deep into what you know and to make your characters real and don't be afraid to make them real in that way that you might think, oh no, nobody would be interested in that. But they are because it's that wholeness and that warmth of character.
Well,
Um, it's just, it's great. Brenda's great. And so is Effie. And if I come on to Effie, because they are the Brenda and Effie mysteries.
absolutely.
So Effie is a sort of fellow investigator of spooky experiences in Whitby, and she's Brenda's sort of next door neighbour. She's in her, I'm guessing, middle 60s,
Yeah.
I'm
When she
thinking.
starts, yeah.
She's diminutive, whereas, Brenda's much larger. She's fragile. She wears elegant vintage clothes a lot of the time. And she makes quite a contrast to Brenda's hefty, more towering form, especially when, Brenda's got her back combed beehive
Beehive.
wig on. But can you tell us now a little bit more about Effie and her family, which is very important to the plots of the novels, where she lives, and again, is she based on anyone you know? But just tell us about Effie.
Well, Effie's the most recent in a long line of witches. And when I've gone back and set stories in the past of this in this universe, you get to see some of those witches and we get some flashbacks. And Effie's kind of she's the furthest end of that dynasty. And she's a bit witchy, but not like the people before. But she's quite haughty and proud of herself. And she bends slowly as the things goes on as the series goes on. She warms up quite a lot, and certainly she and Brenda become best friends. But it takes some doing. She's quite frosty to start
Mm.
with.
Can be very
And
frosty, quite vain. I mean,
yeah,
she's prickly,
yeah.
isn't she, at times?
My nana took up with a quite a posh friend in the late 70s, and she was called Effie actually, Effie Hawes. And my nana was she was from Norfolk but lived in Tyneside most of her life from being a young bride. That's what my sequence of Elsie Mason novels are about.
Right.
Wartime South Shields and all those nanas and aunties. But when I kind of knew, when I was a kid, she used to go around with this quite snooty friend, Effie. Uh, it was quite unlike everybody else. And I was fascinated by the pair of them as this double act, really. So I guess their silhouettes
Yes,
and a hint of their voices come from that double act
great.
that my big nana and Effie Hawes made.
Love it. So moving on, I mean, not moving on from Effie, but developing a little bit more, she becomes very much involved with a fancy man. I love how you call their boyfriend, their lovers, their fancy men. And she takes up with Christophe Alucard. Now, your more astute readers might realize quite soon that Alucard is actually Dracula spelled backwards. And your Dracula, your Alucard, had his Bourneville chocolate eyes, and he's immensely seductive. He's dashing in his cape and he goes dancing with Effie at social events. Um, so you have this sort of very camp character, really, but
Yeah.
also
Yeah.
he can be more sinister. You sometimes have him standing in swollen, not swollen, in
Swollen.
swirls, swirls of frozen mist.
Freudian slip.
Yeah, definitely. Or he's reclining in his coffin in one scene, which she calls
Yeah.
his bachelor pad, which is actually a crypt where Brenda goes to visit because she's a bit suspicious of who he might actually be. But I love the way you develop Effie's affair with the vampire. An older woman with a younger man,
Mm.
and both of them quite beguiled. And meanwhile, Brenda's dark suspicions are eventually confirmed as her memories return. And their interactions can be quite comical. And you take many tropes from the classic vampire canon, you twist and turn them into your own humorous style, such as a scene when Brenda's battling walkers in Primark with bottles of mineral water. Um, and she's trying to fight off the rough trade, the young men who've been drained of their blood. And I won't say how that's happened or who exactly has done that because it's not necessarily just Alucard. Um, and she's shouting Avaunt at them. And there's some very funny scenes like that. But as for Alucard himself, you always keep us guessing as to the real motive for his appearance in Whitby. And he
Mm.
is so unique and he mirrors so many aspects of classic vampiric fiction. And thinking about that, I'd like to ask how much you took in the creation of him from classic books and films.
Oh, I think films more.
Yeah.
Um, I was very much the kind of kid who watched all the old horror classics, Hammer and Universal, late at night in double bills on portable TVs. Um, long after I shouldn't have been watching TV when I was quite
Mm.
young. And and the whole point, in a way, of Whitby is that it's a town filled with those characters. What I loved was when they teamed characters up. in those films,
Mm.
especially the Universal movies, where you'd have all the monsters in one film, and they were extremely camp, but played out with that deadly seriousness. And the idea of the whole Whitby setting is that this is the place where all the wives and girlfriends of those monsters end up. All the men are completely flaky. All the monsters are still running around the world somewhere, or they've, exhausted themselves and vanished. But the wives and girlfriends all live by the seaside, and they team up and have their own adventures. So that was always there behind it. I mean, obviously, I'm steeped in the books and and different iterations of those kinds of characters through literature. My PhD was on Angela Carter, so I love that idea that you squeeze those old books like fruit to distill them into something else.
Mm.
Um, but I would say the films more than the books even
Yes, I
because
agree.
they're
I was
camper.
the same. I think I was the same growing up. I think, watching those old Hammer horror films late at night they used to have them on a Friday night, didn't they?
Yeah,
At about
yeah.
10:30 or 11.
And
And
they
I
just seem to
remember
go on until like the morning, didn't they? They
they
were
did.
all
And I
on.
remember one of my first experiences very late at night when I was about 11 and my brother was about 9 and creeping out of bed and getting up and turning the telly on and watching The Haunting, the
Mm,
1963 version of The Haunting. Oh my God. That certainly had an effect on me. It terrified us. We had to
yeah.
sleep in the same bed holding hands all night. We were terrified. But the old
How
Hammer
could
horror
they?
films were much, much funnier, really. But they were quite funny, I think.
But when you're very young, though, it's there's a sense of the forbidden about it all
Mm.
as well, isn't there? That there's the things that your older relatives have said about these films, and I'll always remember, my auntie Janice couldn't sleep for a month with the light off after The Exorcist, and so that film takes on this amazing charm as a result. It's like, that's the film, that's the one.
That was mythical.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's rare that things have that kind of feeling about them now.
And
We're
the
so.
Abbey at Whitby.
Mhm.
But you imbibe those Gothic ruins with stories of your own and storylines that are very much linked to Brenda and Effie's mission, in inverted commas. They have a definite mission in
Yeah.
Whitby, don't
Yeah,
they?
they do.
And how is the Abbey linked to their mission?
Um, I think it's to do with Buffy the Vampire Slayer, actually. In the back of my head, there was an idea of taking that kind of the idea of people being supernatural guardians of a place and there being a kind of hellmouth out of which monsters and creatures come. And the Abbey just seems perfect for that. This
Hmm.
um, magical place that stands in ruins that clearly has seen a few mysterious and spooky goings on in those whatever 1,000 years of history it's got. Um, and of course, every Gothic story has to have a ruin somewhere in it. And of course, Brenda's the biggest ruin of all, and so she stands as its guardian with Effie alongside her. And then you find out that this has gone on for generations. That during the Second World War, witches danced in the nude to make the Nazis go away, and going back and back and back, and you get glimpses of those histories. So it's a way of tying together the Gothic narratives, the old movie stories, and some of the legends
We
around the
have a
place.
wonderful the abbess who
Yes.
who is like a shriveled up, mummified, nearly practically dead person who sleeps in her son's suitcase and is,
Yeah.
quite a terrifying character actually, with her little pearly teeth and
I'd,
um,
I, I think I, I think a lot of that comes from things like Rider Haggard and those kind of,
yes, you're
slightly,
definitely inspired by Rider Haggard, aren't you? And she,
yeah.
yes, yeah,
Obviously, those films were seen at a very early age, and then visiting the novels and novels by people like Edgar Rice Burroughs. This is kind of
yeah,
pulp
yeah,
stuff,
yeah.
and that stuff finds its home here as well. Because I think all those stories tap into something very persuasive in the unconscious. They.
Absolutely, definitely. And I think going down into the mouth of hell, as it were. I mean, for me, I remember there used to be a cartoon on television, and I'm older than you, so this probably wasn't around. You would have loved it. It was called Journey to the Center of the Earth.
Oh.
brilliant. It was wonderful. Had so many
Wow.
dreams and like fan fiction ideas in my mind of like,
Yeah.
going down under the ground. There always cellars intrigued me after that. Anything you went down underneath.
Yeah.
It was so fascinating. But
Well, the thing
but
that I had when as a kid was At the Earth's Core, with
yeah,
which was Edgar
yeah.
Rice Burroughs, but Peter Cushing and Doug McClure,
Oh yeah.
those kinds of movies, and
Yeah.
dinosaurs stomping about under the ground.
And what was the one about going to the moon? Was it the first man on the moon? I can't remember what it was
Yeah,
called.
yeah, from the
Gosh,
from H.G. Wells
I
with
went
Lionel
to
Jeffries.
the cinema to see that about 7 times. I mean, my auntie ran the cinema, or my
Oh,
my uncle was
wow.
the manager, so we could go whenever we liked for nothing.
Oh,
And there were some films like, A Million Years BC. I don't know how many times I went to see that. But yes, yes, obsessed with anything science fiction-y or so. Talking about settings, then the Abbey we've touched on, but you have got some brilliant settings that crop up and again. And one of them is the Christmas Hotel, which is mainly patronized by OAPs, although there are social events going on there that people in the town go along to as well. And
mm.
Brenda and Effie definitely do. Um, and it's always Christmas Eve, and there's always parties going on such as the 60s night when Brenda turns up in her mini dress with a zip up the front, and she's a bit worried she might be a bit too big for it, but what the hell, she's got it on
Oh, bless
anyway.
her.
And she's just fantastic. And but in your books, this venue, which should be filled with light and laughter, is really unnerving, because it completely inverts our perception of what Christmas should be. So can you tell us a bit about the hotel, how it looks inside, outside, its uniformed staff, what uniform they wear, and the owner who presides over them all in her motorized wheelchair, which is often covered in tinsel. And yes, so just give us a bit of a background to the Christmas Hotel.
Well, it's kind of a real hotel, and it is one of these big, I guess, Georgian hotels that fill a whole block of one of those big streets that face out onto the sea. And the first time we went, it must have been Christmas, or they'd left the decorations up. And I love that kind of bleakness of Christmas existing too far into the year.
Mm.
Here we've got our Christmas tree up and decorations up all year round, and we always have. And that's something I kind of believe in. And the hotel is run by Mrs. Claus, who is this gargantuan monster with her staff of willing elves, and we get to know Robert, who's one of them, and Brenda's friend. But all the elves have to, these young men have to dress up as elves in felt costumes and do her bidding. And then there's a kind of a scandal about cannibalism going on at the Christmas hotel, and people ending up in the pies like Sweeney Todd.
Well, it's not
Um,
just people. You have mermaids ending up in pies as well in the
I've
tagliatelle.
forgotten that. I've forgotten that. It is quite baroque,
Very
I guess.
surreal.
Yeah,
But that's
but
that's late.
we
That's a
keep
later.
going.
That's later on. Yes.
We keep going back and back to the Christmas hotel, and people get. She ends up being younger at some point, Mrs. Claus.
Well,
Um,
I mean, I wanted to talk about that because I think what's really amazing with Mrs. Claus, she's a totally revolting character, to be honest, at first. I mean, she's compelling because, the way you describe her with her voice as shrill as ice limoncello and she's screeching at
mm,
people. And she's quite a monstrous tyrant. Um, but she's also a very complex character. I mean, all your characters are complex. As the books develop, we learn more and more about them. They are not two-dimensional. They
yeah.
develop as time goes by. And I think with Mrs. Claus, you certainly don't flinch from addressing difficult and painful issues. Sometimes, things that happen to people in youth that might affect them and the way they become, and that a monster today might not have always been a monster.
Mm. I'd say
And
that's true, and I think there's something about it's not so much developing characters as kind of taking off another layer, and
mm,
then another, that the kind of onion skin idea that as the stories go on, you can see deeper and deeper into these obfuscations and layers of disguise that people put on. And I'm much more interested in that than the idea of the kind of cod psychological idea of development of character.
Yeah,
I
I mean,
think that's such a
her backstory is incredibly gothic, and it actually explores something which I think is, for me again, the essence of, one of the things that made me and made me the writer I am today is fairy tales. And
mm,
so,
mm,
her actual past is infused with fairy tale, and it's again very seductive, very chilling, and very sad. Her story is very sad.
mm. And I even forget I forget which book that's in. I
Well, no, it's
forget
about
where
six
it's
or
split up in
seven.
episodes
It's
through
getting
things
up,
and you get hints of it.
yeah, yeah. But actually, so there's that, but there's also the fact that Effie, who is the last in a long line of witches,
Mm,
um, she also, I think what you deal with really well, and it goes back to what you were saying before about, being a little child and sitting with the older women in your family and hearing them talking. But with Effie, as I said before, we meet Effie and she's somewhere in her mid-60s. But we also, as the books develop, we see her when she looks back on herself and she sees herself again as, because she does have these witchy qualities and these
mm,
abilities that develop as the books go on. And she sees herself in childhood when her aunts are dancing as witches, these naked dances and jumping through fire to try and keep the Nazis away from Whitby. Um,
Sky clad.
yeah, so we see her in, a little girl with scabs on her knees and these little pigtails. And what I found again profoundly moving is she wakes up from these sort of visions that she's seeing of herself, or she actually time travels actually. But when she comes back and she mentions to Brenda how, when she's looking in the mirror again, and what a shock it is to see
Mm,
her old wrinkled face when she doesn't feel old and she can hardly believe she's the same person. And I think a lot of us can, understand that as we get older.
mm.
You feel you're, one person and you sometimes catch a glimpse of yourself where you see a photograph and you think, oh my goodness, how can that possibly be me? So I think that's really interesting, and the way you take us back and you really develop that, but also how she comes under Alucard's spell and she regains all the bloom and sensuality at one point of her sort of her heyday, as it were, of her
Yeah.
prime. And we just find something that's not just witchy and eccentric, but the sense of a whole life, which I found very affecting. And Brenda as well. She's old. She's very old. She ages more slowly than anybody else over the course of centuries. But there's a tenderness when you look back on her younger self. And again, like Effie, there's some time traveling bits when she actually goes back and there are scenes when she's back in scenes with her younger self. And I won't go into
Mm,
too much detail about what those are and give anything away. But she feels very tenderly towards her younger self because she's less experienced. The Brenda that we know as B&B landlady supremo has reached this point in her life when she's living in Whitby and able to live a little bit more openly and make friends and develop a found family of friends. Um, but there are times in the past when she's had to do jobs that she hides away. So she'll be a lady's maid or she'll be a hat check girl. Things that, where she doesn't have to come into contact too much with the general public. Or if she
mm.
does, it's under cover of night. And again, that's very moving. So she's having these amazing adventures, Sherlock Holmesian and quite
I think literally
supernatural.
Sherlock Holmes in
But
at one point.
but
When
then
she meets
and then
him.
you also have another character who's very Barbara Windsorish, and that's Sheila Manchu,
Yeah.
who is the much younger wife than when she marries the how do you say someone when someone's 100 years old? Oh, well,
Oh, Centenarian.
Anyway,
That
her
sounds right.
husband is,
Yeah.
Moo Moo Manchu, obviously based on um, much more famous character. But so an evil mastermind, and
Mhm.
he retires with Sheila, his much younger glamorous wife, to the coast, where she runs another hotel, well, a bar, a club, the Miramar.
Yeah, it's a kind of a racier place.
Yes, it is a racier place, isn't it? They have grab a granny nights and
Yes.
things like that. But what I'd like you to tell us about, because it's basically delving into again classic Gothic sort of folklore horror, really, is something that goes on at the Miramar, which which is, sorry, I keep laughing, but it's to do with wicker furniture,
Oh yeah.
wrap furniture. So what's the influence for that?
Um,
You've forgotten, you're just remembering, are you? It's,
I am. I am. Well,
burning.
it's Goomba, isn't it? The wickerwork man, and about the the garden furniture being subsumed by this alien intelligence that goes back to the dawn of time. Again, we're back in the land of things like Edgar Rice Burroughs, and I guess Jack Kirby Marvel comics too. That feel kind of makes its presence felt. Those very odd comics of the early 70s and late 60s. And so they're all worshipping garden furniture that they then arrange into the form of this kind of tiki god. And of course, it's all about the like the Fu Manchu stories, this slightly racist um, pulp fiction of the early 20th century that took on tropes from the Far East,
Yeah.
and everything was exotic and therefore a bit strange and dangerous. So even, bamboo wickerwork furniture is potentially deadly. That to me is intrinsically funny and silly.
And it's
So
like the Wicker Man as well, with that burning at
yes,
the
of
end.
course,
So, I mean, it's
which is one of
wonderful.
my favorites as well, of course. But something that's atrociously silly. Um,
Yeah.
but you play it completely straight. You make it even more extreme and play it straight, I think.
It's such a skill you have of doing that because I mean, I just don't know how you do it. But anyway, I mean, one of the reasons it's taken me so long to actually get you to talk to me on this podcast is I was hoping to do it weeks ago, but it took me so long because I started reading through the books again, and I certainly haven't read all of them, but I've read, I was reading and reading and reading, and I've got up to about number seven now. And there's so much to discuss about the Brenda and Effie
You're fond
books.
of a treat.
And
That's what we're saying, I think.
as again, I said before, I don't know why nobody has grabbed these. If anybody is ever listening, who's they would make the most wonderful.
Well, it's
Is it option?
optioned. It's been optioned for a long time.
Yeah.
And the very odd thing with Brenda and Effie is when I was doing them, it's 20 years ago, and I was told by TV and film people, but also by the publisher, that uh, supernatural fiction that's features older women and is, it's cozy detective stories that are a bit supernatural, set in a cozy town with older female leads. It's not a trendy genre.
They
It'll
they
never
have
come in.
no idea, do they? And then you've got
They
that,
don't have any idea.
but they have no idea. It would be absolutely, and it will be. It has to be because honestly, I'm almost sort of. Well, I'm obsessed with these books. I think they're so brilliant. And actually reading, it's about the third or fourth time I've read them now. They're my
Wow, wow.
comfort books. They're my comfort series,
Good, because one
But-
of my, for me, it should be things like Map and Lucia, when people go back to stories like those, and
And they get
it's
better as they go on. They're just wonderful. But I haven't got time to go through it all now, but I've just written down here. I mean, you've got wonderful characters like it is Henry Cleveling, isn't it? A
oh, Henry
member of
Cleaver.
the Smudgelings, a literary group of academics loosely based on the Inklings of
Oh
Oxford
yeah.
University, which really did exist, which included Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. And you do allude to a lot of that. I mean, at one point, I mean, also, I think, I mean, another Oxford writer, Philip Pullman. You have these wonderful pinking shears through which you can, snip through the time space continuum, which
Hmm.
is very Philip Pullman. It's like the subtle knife, but you have pinking shears,
Of course.
and I love that. And so he's another friend of Brenda's, isn't he? And that's how he comes to the town. But he's not just coming there as one of Brenda's fancy men. He's also intent on hunting down demons. And then there's Frank, her somewhat gigantic and misunderstood once betrothed monster who appeals to Mrs. Claus as a perfect bit of rough, which I always think is very funny. Um, and he makes appearances in the novels. And then there's Brenda's much younger friends, Robert, who we've mentioned, who once was an elf but moves on to far better career path, and Penny. Who is a goth who leaves her husband to come to Whitby and be free and be her goth self. And she joins forces solving the eerie mysteries. There's a cable TV team, along with Brian the psychic, who work on a production called Manifest Yourself, which is set in Effie's antique shop and raises far more than they actually expected. And
You
then
know, I
there's
was delighted when the actual people who made Most Haunted were reading these books on their
oh,
locations, and they passed them around and got in touch with me eventually, sometime around 2010. Um, and they had to, Yvette Fielding got in touch saying, we've been, and they loved the fact they were sent up so ruthlessly in these books.
rumbled.
Yeah, because it is pretty ruthless.
It's brilliant. It's just such a wonderful, comparison with them. And I love Manifest Yourself. But you've also got, I mean, from that you go to the extreme of Robert's doomed Aunt Jessie, who at one
Oh
point worked in
yeah.
the Christmas hotel, who ends up going to this new, the Deadly Boutique that opens up in the town, where to have anti-aging treatments, which go a little bit too far. And she ends up regressing and becoming what you call a womansy, which is like a very hairy ape woman, which is
Yeah.
a bit like, the Victorian freak shows where they used to have things called, what is it? What is it?
It's the non-such.
The non-such, definitely. And so Paul has rather tragic fate that she has, really. Poor doomed Jessie. And Robert has his own, interludes
Hmm.
on a flying velvet sofa with a
Yes,
very
he does.
seductive gentleman, which are very, very funny. And at some point, that the gentleman he meets on the flying velvet sofa is also involved with other people in the book and appears on the back of black horses in, somewhat more
Right.
fairy tale situations. So we
He's
have
the Earl King, isn't he?
He's the
That's what he
Earl
is.
King.
Yeah.
Yes, he's the Earl King. So you have all this fairy tale thing. And I was going to say also the echoes of She and Rider Haggard, but we've talked about that. Um, and, it's just, you have allusions to so many things like the monkey's paw, that classic
Mm.
story, the monkey's paw and the three wishes. And you have a stuffed panda, who I know you're
Cool.
quite fond of, who can really walk and talk. And he gets mixed up in a story which is linked to the Bronte sisters in Haworth. And you actually have Effie going back in time as a child evacuee to Haworth, meeting the ghosts of the Bronte sisters and becoming one of Charlotte's angels. Because Charlotte Bronte, the ghost of, teaches gifted children, i.e., witches, in the arts of dark magic. And, we have some very interesting scenes with Bronte sisters, which are not quite what anybody would expect. So, and that was just a touch of genius.
I need to
And
revisit that stuff.
you must do. You've probably written so much, I know, that you probably, But anyway, the ingenuity of your imagination, Paul, is marvelous. And I do hope my wish comes true and your options get taken.
I
Um,
hope so.
I'd love to see who gets cast. But speaking of castings, I just want to mention to anybody who likes to listen to audiobooks rather than
Oh,
reading books, is that you have two wonderful narrators for the audiobooks, Joanna Tope
mm.
and Anne Reid, and they conjure up to such vivid life the humour and the plots and the amazing characters and the atmospheric setting of Whitby.
Well,
It's
we must say a word for
a
Jo Tope because she was our stalwart. She died last year, the beginning of this year.
story.
But she read the original short story on Radio 4 that this all comes from in 1998. And then she did the Radio 7 series that we did. And then she read all of the novels unabridged, seven of them.
She
Um,
does them absolutely
and
brilliantly.
she's amazing. She was so wonderful. And she was so loyal and obsessed with Brenda. Um, and yeah, she
She
died.
is, Brenda. She's it's just, oh, I'm so sorry to hear that because what a
Yeah,
talent. Oh,
yeah.
that's a shame. Um, oh, that's a sad thing to lead on. But it's a lovely legacy
But
she's
she's
had.
there forever. I mean, one of the things
Well, it's not just
about
Brenda and Effie forever, it's Joanna forever then.
yes, yes. You know, I used to get Christmas cards signed from Brenda. And then when they did the individual stories that Audible did, and they got Anne Reid, it was very difficult because, of course, Audible wants to go with a famous face and all of that. So that was quite difficult. I think Anne Reid does a terrific job as well. Although she
There's a
reads a lot.
wonderful picture of Anne dressed up as Brenda
Yeah,
that I found a photograph of, and I'll put that in with the in with the images, which is rather wonderful. She obviously took Brenda to heart as well.
yeah, yeah. Yeah,
Mm.
she really enjoyed it. I got a nice message. about all of that, about recording those.
Oh, well, I think it's probably time to end this episode, which is very sad. You'll have to come back on again and talk about some other things. I need to
Yes.
see some other work that you do. But can we finish this episode with two things? First of all, before I say goodbye, I'd like you to tell us what you're working on now, because I was reading that there's something else linked to Whitby, perhaps. Um,
Hmm.
and then when you've done that, can you give us a recommendation, something Gothic that you think our listeners, I should say, might enjoy? It doesn't necessarily have to be something they've never heard of. I mean, just
Yeah.
something from the Gothic canon of it can be a film, it can be music, it can be a book, whatever you like.
Okay. Um, uh, I've just published something that I wrote last year, which is a return to Whitby, but it's with Puffin Books, and it's the latest in the line of these Doctor Who novels where Doctor Who mashes up with literary classics from the kind of children's literature world. And I've done four of them. I did Robin Hood, like in the old Roger Lancelin Green version of Robin Hood,
Mhm.
and I did Jason and the Argonauts, and I did Wonderland. But this year's Dracula, and I've gone back to the original Doctor Who from the early 60s and placed it in 1901. So we see precursors of the Brenda and Effie characters. I like to have my universes overlap when I do stuff.
Yeah.
So that's come out this week alongside a book of short stories I did for Penguin about Doctor Who, which is a kind of Scheherazade version of Doctor Who with stories within stories retold, called 1001 Nights in Time and Space. So there's been quite a lot of Doctor Who. But the thing I've been writing this year, which is just going out to editors at the moment, is a memoir, um, a fictionalized memoir of my years teaching the MA in creative writing at UEA in the late 90s, when universities were quite different, when
Mm,
creative writing was very different, and when you had people coming all the week, all these amazing writers coming to talk to us and misbehave, really. We'd have to take them out, and all these incredible people around the place. So it's a kind of comedy of manners set in a university called If Only They Could Write, which is kind of something that I've spent a long time doing, but it's taken a long time to get to. It's, I guess, 25 years since I was teaching there.
I look
Um,
forward to reading that. That
It was
sounds
my
great.
first job. I was 27 and put straight into the middle of the MA in creative writing, teaching it with Andrew Motion when, um, you know, coming from the north and being, someone who'd ne never been amongst these kinds of people before. Well, I had a bit, but not much. Slightly patronized, shall I say, but an interesting mix of people. And, that kind of stuff goes in deep and you record everything. It's like Zoom, recording now.
Yes.
And so all the stories are there. So it was good to unpack all of that stuff. Um, yeah, so that's what I've been doing. And a recommendation of something
Mm.
gothic, or spooky. Um, do you know, I would recommend, because I don't see her around and I don't think she's published in this country. There was a vogue about 20 years ago for urban supernatural stories in America, and there was a whole genre of them. And it became dark fantasy, and now it's romantasy. Um, and they become a bit wispy and mythological. But back then they were set in cities or small towns and recognizable places. And there was a wonderful writer, she's still going, called Yasmin Gale Norn,
Right.
which is a name to conjure with. And she had a series, and the first one is Ghost of a Chance. And I think it's all mythological stories. She has a tea shop that she runs with her daughter. It's very cozy mystery, but with these monsters coming in, and there's a bit of romance. And there was about six in this series, and I absolutely loved them.
Thank you. That's brilliant. Well, if you could you send me a link to the correct spelling for that, and then I will add that uh,
Yes,
just so that people absolutely get it right. But that
I
sounds
will do.
great.
Yeah,
Oh,
she's like Yasmin Gale Norn, and she's on. I think it's all on Kindle now. She was published by, I think Barclay, who does all the cozy mysteries. But I think she took all the copyright back and put them out on Kindle, so they're available again.
good. That's great to know. Well, thank you so much. And it's been an absolute delight to talk to you.
Well, thank you.
And I think I'll be seeing you in Whitby later this year when we're both going to be, I believe, at the Whitby Festival, a new
That's
festival.
right, in November.
So Whitby is going to feature very strongly in
Which
our lives in the
which
month
day have
of
they got
November.
you reading on?
I'm not sure. I'll have to check that. I'll have to check that. But I'll put all the details about when you're going to be there again in the
Yes. Yeah.
Substack underneath, and then hopefully anybody who would like to come and see you and hear more about everything you're working on will do that. But thank you, Paul. It's been an absolute delight to talk to you.
No, it's a lovely chance to talk about Brenda and Effie because it always feels like kind of reviving them somehow.
Yeah. Oh,
Um,
and they deserve it.
thank you. Thanks for your support.
I so enjoyed speaking to Paul today for this episode of Talking the Gothic and for my own recommendation this month. And for those of you who might want to take a deeper look into this dark or gallows humour, I'm going to recommend something that's actually on my wish list. So I haven't read it as yet, but I hope to. And that's the Edinburgh Companion to Comic Gothic, exploring the role of irony, satire, parody, pastiche, and the absurd in Gothic texts dating from the 18th century right up until the present day. I don't really know exactly what it contains, but I shall be very interested to find out. It's a more academic text, and the hardback is very expensive, but the paperback will be published in January 2026. So not too long to wait. Meanwhile, if you have any suggestions we've not touched on in this podcast, I'd love to hear what they are. And until we meet again, goodbye for now from me, Essie Fox, talking the Gothic.